Great. Well, I get to talk about the 80s. That was the years of improvement. We went from outhouses to porta potties, if you remember that. That was a big deal because I don't know what it was, Carolyn, but you were fascinated by that sucker truck that would come by every day. And Ron and I and you would stand up there and be fascinated by this guy sucking this thing out. And well, we had lots of new improvements. We actually had we built a kitchen, and the kitchen served us well. It was great. But you know, the thing that I remember most about Mexicali were those times in the evening when all of us would come back to the main camp at Cuernavaca, and we just worship. We'd turn off the lights. We'd have remember the students, they would turn towards the sound booth, and we would just sing together. And Brian Tippett and Mr. Newman would lead us in those songs, and they were just incredible praise. It was great. We did some really stupid things in the 80s. Ron and I would room together in a little RV. Now, that was also an improvement. We went from tents to RVs for the speakers. We appreciated that, Carolyn. That was a good thing. Everybody else was jealous of us, but certainly that changed now. But I remember, Ron, one of the dumbest things you did was we were sitting in that trailer, and we used to burn the trash. You remember this? And you remember the wind that you talked about, Jason? You remember the good idea you had, let's burn the trash one day? So Ron goes out and he lights this trash pile on fire, and these embers are now flying over tents. And I still have a memory of Carolyn with a broom chasing these things, trying to knock them down. It was just great. It was just really fun. I learned to speak in Mexicali with Ron. Ron took me as a young youth pastor. It was in 1976. Had a student from APU, at that time, walked into my office at the Evangelical Free Church of Walnut Creek and said, "Would you like to take your students to Mexico?" We said, "Sure." And from that moment on, our lives were changed. From that moment on, I became a product of this ministry. I learned to speak there. I learned to have confidence in front of a crowd. I remember watching Ron taught me some things. I remember one time kids were taking food from the front of the line and giving it to the Mexican children. And my response as a dean was, said, "Quit doing that, we got food." Ron gets up there and he says, "You know what, we don't mind you giving your own food away. But when you give your food away, you take 2 plates, you're really giving away somebody else's plate." I thought, what a different philosophy of how can we learn to share the gospel together. But I also remember in the 80s when it grew and got so big. I can't remember the numbers. I want to say 3,000 maybe in Cuernavaca. And we decided, could we open up a couple of other camps? So we started Veracruz and Muscatal, and it was just great to open those new sites. And I remember as we thought it couldn't get any bigger and it couldn't get any better, I remember Ron saying to me, if we could figure out what makes this work, we would screw it up. We would screw it up. And that's the beauty of Mexicali, that you can't figure it out. I remember the wind would come, and it was just so bizarre to think about. Students would come and they would sit in the dirt. And I remember one night preaching in front of this group down in we were in Veracruz, and the wind was blowing and the sand was blowing in the kid's face. And I said, just turn around. And so there I was speaking to everyone turning the other way. And it was the time when do you remember when we would ask for people to come to know Christ? You came down here to serve, but maybe you don't know Jesus. And it's the most bizarre invitation I've ever given when students turning the other way were standing up saying, "I want to receive Christ." And that's what Mexicali is. It's something that's changed my life. We had some great stories. There are some things that we did that we cannot talk about. John, if you think you knew about the liabilities, trust me. Trust me, there were things that I think about that we did that we would lose our jobs for right now. But you know, God protected us and watched over us during the 80s. But you know, it's like God dropped a pebble at APU in a pond, And there's ripples to that pebble. Most of you are part of the ripples. And it began to change certain lives. And when I was through being a youth pastor, we started a Mexicali urban called the Center for Student Missions. And 100,000 kids have gone through that program since we started, and it was all Mexicali driven. We just said, we can do this. Can we do it in the city? I remember you giving me that encouragement. And Noel and Kyle Bicchetti took that dream and grew it. The last Thursday night, I was in Portland, Oregon, with some of our missionaries with the group I work with now. We were feeding people under a bridge, the Burnside Bridge in Portland, Oregon. And the guy who runs this ministry for the last 6 years comes to me and says, I know you from someplace. And I said, well, yeah, let's talk about it. He says, well, did you ever go to Mexico? I said, yeah, I went to Mexico. And I was a dean, spoke a little bit. He said, do you ever run a program in L.A. called the Center for Student Missions? Yeah, I did that. He says, you know what? The reason I'm here today is because what took place in Mexicali and was founded in other places. And I just kind of see Mexicali as God dropping a pebble called Carolyn in our culture. And it just spreads and spreads and spreads. And I think there is going to come a day, Carolyn, when we get to heaven and we're going to be able to see the results of the thousands of people who have been to Mexicali. And I'm really excited about it. I'm a product of this place. I am so thankful. And I was just thinking the other day how great it was to be part of this ministry and to watch what God has done. In the 80s, we exploded. We just exploded. And I think we also need to thank Azusa Pacific University. I have no idea why you let us drive those vans. No wonder they broke. We drove like a bat out of Azusa. I mean, it was just no license. I remember it was just bizarre. But you know what? The risk was there, and the risk has paid off. That's what happened in the 80s. The 80s was the time when we just exploded. I do remember one other time, though, when we learned about keeping food out of covered so that the flies would not land on it. If you remember that day, when Veracruz, when almost the entire camp got sick, and buses would come in, and people were kind of laying on there because we had to learn how to do our food differently. But God protected us. God kept us safe. That was the 80s. Carolyn and Ron and the whole gang. John, thanks for letting us be part of what God has done here. It's a marvelous ministry that has fruit all around the world, and we're very grateful. How many of you were there in the 80s? If you were there in the 80s, would you stand up? Our 80s people. That's great. Perfect. Well, let's move on to the 90s.